December 9th, 1940, just before sunrise, the Italian outposts around Sidi Barrani were listening to a sound that did not make sense. Engines, tracks, metal grinding over hard ground, the kind of noise you expect on a road or a staging area, not out in the open desert. From the Italian point of view, it could not be British armor. Their camps and strongpoints sat deep inside Egypt, supplied along the coast, and protected by defenses built to face the obvious threat from the east, toward the British line back near Mersa Matruh. The empty south was supposed to be a natural wall. Italian commanders had treated that desert like a dead zone. No water, few landmarks, brutal wear on machines, and too much risk for any tank force that tried to cross it. Then the impossible happened. Out of the darkness, British Matilda tanks pushed in from the south, not from the coast road, not from the expected direction. They came from the wrong side of the battlefield, where the sand should have been empty. In hours, positions that looked solid on a map were cracking. The Matildas were slow, but they were tough. And in those first blows, they had a terrifying advantage. Surprise from an angle the defenders had not planned to cover. It rattled the Italians, and it planted a seed in the minds of the Germans who arrived soon after to figure out what had gone wrong. When German liaison officers talked to survivors and visited the wreckage, the same idea kept coming up. The British tanks had seemed to appear out of nowhere and then slip away again into the same desert that was supposed to stop them. Not magic, not literally invisible, but so unexpected that it felt unreal in the moment. That feeling would turn into a nickname. German soldiers in North Africa started describing British armor as desert ghosts. Early on, it was more of a jab than a compliment, like saying, "They won't stand and fight." But as months passed, that tone changed. The ghost label stuck because it described a real tactical problem the Germans were struggling to solve. British tanks kept showing up where German doctrine said they shouldn't be able to show up. To understand why, it helps to look at what the Germans believed when their first major forces reached North Africa in early 1941. German intelligence did not rate British tanks very highly. The Matilda had thick armor but moved like a truck stuck in low gear, and its gun was not designed for modern tank versus tank fights. The Crusader could run fast on paper, but it had reliability issues and thinner protection. On the German side, Panzer III and Panzer IV models were improving, and German crews had just run through Poland and France with a mix of better tactics, good radios, and aggressive maneuver. So the expectation was simple. German armor would outfight British armor the way it had outclassed other opponents in 1940. In one sense, that was fair. The Germans often did have the edge in guns and at times in overall armored coordination, but the conclusion the Germans drew from that equipment comparison was the real mistake. They assumed the British would fight in familiar patterns, approaching along predictable routes, using clear landmarks, and staying tied to roads the way European armies did. In the desert, that was a dangerous assumption. When German units first tangled with Britain's mobile forces, especially the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, they started reporting things that sounded like exaggerations. British tanks would hit a flank without being spotted on the way in. They would show up at dawn from a direction that patrols had checked the evening before. They would pull back when pressed, then return a few hours later from a different angle, like the same unit had teleported across the map. And the biggest shock was navigation. To German crews trained in Europe, the open desert looked like a blank page. No towns, few trees, long flat stretches that seemed identical in every direction. German formations leaned on roads, track networks, and recognizable points, anything that let them keep their bearings and keep supply moving. But British crews, by early 1941, had been living and training in that environment long enough to build a different skill set. They were learning the desert the way sailors learn the sea. Instead of trusting magnetic compasses that could be unreliable in certain areas, British units used sun compasses during the day, tools designed to give direction based on the sun's position. At night, they practiced navigation by the stars. That sounds dramatic, but it is really just disciplined math and habit. Keep a bearing, estimate distance, correct drift, and check against the sky. They also trained themselves to notice desert details that did not look like details at all to a newcomer. A slight rise, a change in sand color, a line of rocks, a shallow depression that only mattered if you understood how it shaped sightlines. Over time, those small cues became a kind of map inside the crew's head. For the Germans, this was not just interesting, it was threatening. Because once a force can navigate confidently across open desert, the battlefield expands. Suddenly, there are not a few approach routes, there are hundreds. You cannot just mine the road, guard the bridge, and assume that blocks movement. The enemy can bypass those control points and still arrive on time. That is what Ghost really meant in 1941. The British had freedom of movement the Germans did not expect, and the Germans did not yet know how to match it. British units leaned into that advantage with a style of fighting designed to frustrate pursuit. They could move at night across open ground, cover serious distance, and be in position at first light. They could hit a target, cause damage, and then withdraw before German reserves could concentrate. Then, instead of retreating along one obvious line, they could fade out into the open desert and relocate, making it hard for German tanks, still cautious about leaving known routes, to chase them with confidence. That caution mattered. It wasn't just fear, it was logistics and risk management. A tank force that gets lost in the desert can burn fuel, break down, and become helpless in the worst place possible. In early 1941, many German formations did not have the same navigation training, and they were still learning the hard way what the desert demanded. So German after-action reports started to read like complaints about broken rules. Reconnaissance would declare a sector clear, and then British armor would appear there anyway. Rear areas that seemed safe would get raided. Lines of communication would get disturbed by small, fast strikes, and when the Germans tried to push back, the British would refuse the kind of clean, decisive tank duel the Germans preferred. The British were not claiming they had better tanks. They were building fights around what they did have: mobility across open ground, the ability to pick approach angles, and the discipline to disengage before the Germans could bring their strengths to bear. Terrain knowledge amplified this even more. In Europe, cover is obvious. A village, a tree line, a hill. In the desert, new arrivals often assumed there was no cover at all. That assumption was a trap. A small change in elevation, something you would barely notice on a casual drive, could let a tank hide most of its body while exposing only its turret. A dry riverbed, a shallow wadi, could conceal a line of vehicles from observers at distance. A low ridge could block vision and create a perfect ambush point. The flat desert was not really flat, and crews who learned to read it could survive and strike in ways that looked unnatural to opponents who treated the desert like a shooting range. By mid-1941, German intelligence officers were collecting these patterns from multiple fights. The conclusion was uncomfortable but clear. British armored tactics in North Africa did not follow the European script. They exploited terrain the Germans had dismissed. They navigated without the obvious references German units relied on. They conducted movements at night with more confidence than German doctrine assumed was practical, and that is when the nickname begins to harden into something more than sarcasm. Because once you accept the British can cross the empty parts of the map, every plan gets harder. Defensive lines tied to roads become less secure. Predictions based on choke points become less reliable. Even the simple question, "Where is the enemy?" gets more confusing, because the enemy can shift position without leaving obvious signs that your patrols know how to read. In the next phase of the campaign, the Germans would start trying to solve the riddle: how the British were navigating, how they were supplying themselves off the roads, and how a force that looked weaker on paper kept finding ways to strike first. For more stories where training flips the fight, subscribe now. Next part shows how the ghosts reshape German planning. By the summer of 1941, German units in North Africa had stopped treating British desert ghost behavior as a one-off surprise. It was now a pattern, and patterns force armies to adapt, whether they like it or not. At first, the nickname had an edge to it, like the British were slippery because they would not sit still for the kind of stand-up tank fight German crews preferred. But the tone changed as the same thing kept happening. British armor would show up fast, strike hard enough to sting, then slide away before German units could bring their heavier punches into play. German reports started describing a frustrating loop. Recon patrols would sweep an area and see nothing. The sector would be marked quiet. Then at dawn, British tanks would appear from a direction that looked irrational, across open desert, far from roads, far from the places German units assumed an armored force would risk traveling. The British would fire, knock out a few vehicles, disrupt a position, and pull back. When German armor pursued, the chase would often die in the open sands. The British did not disappear in a literal way. They just moved with enough confidence across terrain the Germans still distrusted that contact would break, and then it would be hard to regain. This wasn't superstition, it was a gap in preparation. British crews had been building desert skills for months. For many German units arriving in 1941, North Africa still felt like a quick assignment, not a long education. That mindset mattered. Desert navigation is not a trick you pick up after 2 brief briefings. It is training, repetition, and discipline. If a unit does not invest the time, it stays tied to predictable routes. And in the desert, predictable can get you killed. German planners began to understand the core issue. Roads were more than convenience. Roads were control. If your logistics and navigation keep you near roads, the enemy can guess where you'll be tomorrow. If the enemy can travel off-road with confidence, they can choose where the fight happens. That difference shaped the entire chessboard. German forces, by necessity, leaned on coastal supply lines and defined tracks. Fuel, water, spare parts, ammunition, everything moved more smoothly when you stayed on known routes. British forces also depended on supply, of course, but their operating style showed more flexibility across open desert. Even when British radios struggled at long distances, they could still coordinate through pre-planned rendezvous points and bearings, because they could actually reach those points in the first place. And once German troops realized the British could do that, the nickname Ghosts stopped being cute. It became a warning. A patrol report saying British armor may be in this sector carried a different weight now, because in this sector did not mean on this road. It meant anywhere within reach of a night move. It meant the enemy might be sitting in a shallow depression you'd drive right past without noticing. It meant the enemy could come from a direction your maps didn't naturally highlight. That uncertainty has a real psychological cost. One of the clearest effects was over-reporting. If a small British armored group hit a position at dawn, pulled out, relocated, and hit again near dusk from another angle, German troops might report 2 separate forces, not because they were trying to lie, but because the alternative felt unbelievable. The same unit could not have moved that far, that fast, across open desert, unless it could. British commanders understood the benefit of that confusion. If the enemy thinks you are in 2 places at once, they start spreading their strength thin. They start defending everything and controlling nothing. They start reacting instead of planning. In a desert war where supply lines are fragile, forcing the enemy to chase shadows is almost as useful as winning a clean battle. This is why German intelligence summaries from 1941 sound irritated. They describe British armor appearing in areas that had supposedly been cleared. They describe attacks from odd angles. They describe British mobility as if it breaks the normal rules of warfare, but the rules were not broken. The Germans had simply walked into a different kind of battlefield. Then came Operation Crusader in November 1941, which put this ghost problem under a magnifying glass. The fighting around Tobruk and the wider front was messy, fast-moving, and often confusing, even for the people involved. But from the German perspective, one feature stood out. British armored pressure seemed to come from multiple directions in a way that was hard to pin down. German commanders would prepare to meet an expected thrust. Then another British force would show up on a flank or in a rear area. The Germans would pivot. Then pressure would come from somewhere else. Sometimes it wasn't a huge attack, just enough tanks to disrupt, delay, or force a reorientation. But those small moves had big effects when they broke timing and coordination. The Germans were skilled at concentrated maneuver, but concentration requires confidence that you know where the enemy is not. The British, with better comfort navigating open desert, made that confidence harder to maintain. And because the desert has few natural barriers, the British had more approach options than German planning tools were built to handle quickly. Minefields and strongpoints could still matter, but they didn't create the same hard corners you'd get in Europe, where forests, rivers, and cities funnel movement. In North Africa, the funnel could be bypassed if you could navigate. German countermeasures often looked logical on paper and disappointing in practice. You can mine roads. You can guard choke points. You can destroy bridges. But if the enemy doesn't need the road trap only catches the enemy who chooses to step into it. So the Germans began to chase answers. How are the British navigating? How are they moving at night? How are they using terrain that looks empty? The blunt answer was training. The British had practiced. They had drilled navigation until it felt normal. They had taught crews to trust bearings, distance estimates, and the sky. They had learned to read subtle terrain and to use it like cover. They had accepted night movement as a tool, not a gamble. The Germans would improve over time, but improvement takes time you don't get for free in the middle of a campaign. As 1942 arrived, the fighting escalated, and the Desert Ghosts faced a new problem. German tactical skill was catching up fast, and German commanders were becoming more aggressive and more accurate about how to counter mobile raids. The battles around Gazala in mid-1942 show this tension clearly. German forces achieved major successes there through bold maneuver and by exploiting weaknesses in British command and coordination. The British did not always manage their armor well. They sometimes fed units into fights in ways that reduced their advantage. And when German anti-tank defenses were positioned well, British tanks could take harsh losses. But even in moments when British armored units were pushed back hard, the ghost quality did not vanish. Units that German forces believed were trapped or neutralized sometimes slipped out at night, not as some mystical escape, but because a force that can navigate in darkness has more doors to choose from. Encirclement in the desert is not the same as encirclement in a city. If there is a gap, even a narrow one, and you can move in the dark without getting lost, you can sometimes slide through. German after-action notes from this period repeatedly return to the same theme. British armored forces could reform and reappear faster than expected. That made battle damage assessment unreliable. A unit that looked finished might show up again days later. Sometimes the explanation was simple: repairs, replacements, and regrouping. But the speed of reappearance often came down to mobility and navigation. If you can move off-road confidently, you can relocate without being tracked easily. This is where the nickname becomes fully earned. A ghost is not just something you can't see. It's something you can't pin down. Something that refuses to be where your logic says it must be. British armor in the desert had become that kind of opponent, elusive when threatened, aggressive when an opening appeared, and then the equipment picture began to change. Earlier in the campaign, German tank crews often leaned on a comfortable belief: even if the British are annoying, our guns and armor will settle it when we bring them to a decisive fight. That belief depended on one key condition: when the fight happens, German firepower is clearly superior. By mid-1942, that condition started slipping. American-built tanks began arriving in larger numbers, including the Grant and then the Sherman. These tanks mattered not because they were perfect, but because they changed the British toolkit. More reliable machines, better sustained operations, and, most important, guns that gave British armor more punch at useful ranges than the old 2-pounder setup. That didn't suddenly make British armor unbeatable. Training, tactics, and command still decided outcomes, but the balance shifted. If British forces could combine their movement advantage with more credible firepower, the hit-and-run style became far more dangerous. A brief engagement was no longer just a nuisance. It could cost German tanks, not just trucks and morale. German crews began to describe the change in practical terms. The ghosts had teeth now. The British still appeared from odd directions. They still withdrew when pressed. They still made pursuit difficult. But now, during those short windows of contact, they could do more damage. And that is the turning point for the nickname. In 1941, Desert Ghosts could be read as mockery. They won't stand and fight. By 1942, it carried respect and caution. They can show up anywhere, and they can hurt you before you can respond. The desert had not changed. The sky was the same. The sand was the same. What changed was the way armies used it. The British had turned navigation into a weapon. They had turned the empty spaces on the map into routes. They had learned to fight in a landscape that punishes hesitation and rewards preparation. German forces, still often tied to roads and predictable movement, were slowly learning the same lesson, but learning late is expensive. And in the next phase of the campaign, the ghost problem would collide with the worst-case scenario for the Germans: British forces bringing their mobility together with mass, planning, and sustained pressure, pushing the fight into a direction where disappearing tricks aren't just annoying, they become operationally decisive. By late 1942, the Desert Ghost idea wasn't just a battlefield story told by tired tank crews. It had turned into something German commanders had to plan around. At the start of the North African campaign, German confidence leaned heavily on a simple formula: better guns, tighter armored doctrine, and decisive maneuver would solve most problems. But desert warfare kept punishing the same blind spot. If the enemy can move where you can't, your strengths don't always get a chance to matter. British armored forces didn't become ghosts because they were invisible. They became ghosts because they controlled the timing and direction of contact more often than their opponents expected. They made the battlefield larger. They turned empty desert into maneuver space. And, over time, they built a professional confidence operating off-road that German forces struggled to match fast enough. This mattered most when the campaign shifted into its decisive phase. El Alamein in October 1942. For German forces, the desert had always been a strange kind of double-edged sword. In open terrain, they could sometimes use anti-tank defenses, tactical skill, and aggressive countermaneuver to punish British mistakes. But the desert also meant long supply lines and a constant dependency on predictable routes, especially the coastal road and the infrastructure that supported it. El Alamein compressed the battlefield and raised the stakes. It was not the kind of fluid, wide-open raiding war where small forces could vanish into the horizon and come back later. It was a large, methodical battle where the British had the time and space to prepare, and where the Axis forces faced a defense that would be worn down by sustained pressure. And yet, even inside a set-piece battle, the skills that created desert ghosts still mattered. British units had spent years learning how to move in darkness, how to maintain bearings, how to keep formations together without getting lost, and how to read ground that looked empty from a distance. In the chaos of minefields, defensive belts, and artillery fire, those skills weren't flashy. They were practical. They helped the British do something that always terrified defenders: find a way through, and then exploit it fast. German engineers and anti-tank planners liked the idea of channeling British armor into killing zones. That's a sound concept. You funnel the enemy into places covered by guns. You shape the fight. But funnels only work if the enemy has to enter them. At El Alamein, the British did not rely on a single obvious path. Their infantry and artillery did the grinding work to open gaps and weaken forward defenses. Once breaches formed, British armor pressed through with momentum. And when the fighting moved into the confusing space between minefields, dust, darkness, and disorganized lines, the British ability to navigate and keep moving became a force multiplier. From the German side, this could feel like being outpaced inside your own defense plan. Positions built to face one kind of approach suddenly found pressure from angles that were harder to anticipate. Local commanders were forced to make rapid adjustments while under artillery and air attack. And in that environment, the enemy's mobility and confidence off-road could turn small openings into big problems. Then came the retreat. Retreat in North Africa wasn't just move backward. It was a logistics event. It meant pulling men, fuel, water, ammunition, and damaged vehicles along routes you could actually support. For Axis forces, that usually meant sticking close to the coast and the main roads, because those were the only reliable arteries for supply and movement. British pursuit didn't always stay locked to those same arteries. This is where the ghost label becomes brutally logical. If one side must travel along predictable routes, and the other side can parallel those routes across open desert, the pursuer gains options. They can attempt to cut ahead, threaten flanks, and attack columns when they are most exposed, at dawn, while reorganizing, refueling, or crossing choke points. A retreating column is vulnerable because it's stretched out and busy. It has trucks, fuel, stragglers, repair teams, and wounded. It can't always deploy into neat combat formations on command, and it can't easily hide on a long road. British armored units that could navigate in darkness and move cross-country had a way to keep pressure on without always needing a full decisive tank battle. They could harass, disrupt, force repeated defensive deployments, and accelerate the exhaustion of an opponent already fighting the clock and fuel levels. The human effect of that kind of pursuit is hard to overstate. When a unit believes the enemy can appear ahead of them, when the enemy feels everywhere, discipline gets strained. Reports become jumpy, rumors spread, troops see dust on the horizon and assume it's armor. Rear guard elements become tense and overworked. A retreat that should be a controlled withdrawal turns into a running problem set. Protect the road, protect the fuel, protect the wounded, protect the gaps, watch the flanks, watch the skies. The desert ghost is not a monster. It's the feeling that your enemy has more freedom than you do. As the Axis forces fell back toward Tunisia, that difference in freedom kept shaping the operational picture. Even when British forces didn't achieve perfect interceptions, the constant threat of appearing off route forced Axis commanders to plan and move defensively, spending time and energy guarding possibilities instead of focusing on one clear line of action. By 1943, as the North African campaign ended in Axis surrender in Tunisia, the nickname had spread beyond a single unit's slang. It had become shorthand for something professional soldiers recognize immediately, an opponent who understands the environment better than you do. And after the war, assessments made the contrast even clearer. Aerial reconnaissance photographs of vehicle tracks became a kind of map of habits. Movement patterns visible from above showed the difference between armies that behave like road traffic and armies that behave like ships at sea. German movements often clustered along established routes. Even when they moved off-road, formations tended to follow existing tracks, reinforcing them into recognizable paths. That makes sense if you're trying to reduce risk. Follow what has worked before, but it also makes you easier to predict. British movements, by comparison, showed more cross-country variety. Units navigated independently, creating new track patterns rather than repeating the same lines. That's what confidence looks like from the air. Less dependence on yesterday's path. None of this means the British won solely because of navigation. Tactics mattered, logistics mattered, leadership mattered, intelligence mattered, equipment mattered, and it mattered a lot more as British armor improved and American-built tanks strengthened their firepower and endurance. The North African campaign was not won by a single trick, but navigation was the base layer that made many other advantages possible. If you can navigate, you can choose routes. If you can choose routes, you can choose where contact happens. If you can choose where contact happens, you can shape the range and angle of fights. If you can shape the fight, you can sometimes neutralize an opponent's superior gun or armor by refusing the perfect engagement they want. That's why the Germans kept coming back to the same complaint in their reports. British forces did not behave the way their doctrine expected, not because the British were magical, because the British were prepared for that environment in a way the Germans initially were not. Even the Italians who fought alongside German units developed their own versions of the same nickname. Different words, same meaning. British armor seemed to do impossible things, appearing where it shouldn't, moving when movement felt suicidal, striking and then slipping away. That impression wasn't created by rumor alone. It was created by repeated experience against crews who had drilled a hard skill until it looked effortless. And the British tank crews, for their part, understood exactly what they were doing. They knew German gunnery and armor tactics could be deadly in a straight duel. They knew the German army wanted decisive engagements where it could concentrate and destroy. So British units often tried to deny that kind of clean fight, especially when they lacked the equipment to win it. They used the desert like cover, like distance, like a maze that only becomes a maze when the other side doesn't know how to read it. That is the core truth behind desert ghosts. It wasn't about hiding. It was about mobility that seemed unnatural to an opponent, trained in a different theater. It was about night movement across open ground. It was about using subtle terrain for hull-down positions and concealed approaches. It was about withdrawing and redeploying fast enough to create confusion and false impressions of strength. It was about turning the empty parts of the map into real options, while the enemy stayed tied to roads and predictable lines. Over 3 years, the Afrika Korps and its allies fought an opponent that kept forcing the same lesson. In the desert, your relationship with the terrain is not background. It's a weapon. British armored forces earned the Ghost reputation the hard way, through training, repetition, and the willingness to learn what the desert demanded. German soldiers used the nickname because it captured how it felt to face that kind of enemy. Tanks that arrived from directions that looked impossible, fought on terms that were hard to control, and then slipped back into the sand before you could land a clean, decisive blow. In the end, desert ghosts became recognition. Not because British tanks were supernatural, because British crews mastered a battlefield their opponents never fully learned to read.